This is the last panel of a long, productive day. This is my first trip across the Atlantic since the pandemic began, and it's been a worthwhile trip. Many reasons, including today, and perhaps I'll have the occasion to say a little bit more about that in the discussion. The topic is systematic stewardship. What is it, and how is it pursued? So before I introduce the panelists who are going to address this, I thought I would perhaps say to provide an account of systematic stewardship. I think I'm giving myself credit for having coined the term. I'm not sure if I'm entitled, but I have an article coming out that is titled that. So I'll give my version of systematic stewardship. What's been so fascinating in the discussion as we put the panel together has been that systematic stewardship has meanings far beyond what I thought by others. So this is a bit like an author who's lost control of his own metaphor, I think, but that's okay. So the conception of systematic stewardship that I started with is an effort to guide the investment behavior of the large diversified asset manager whose product is a fully diversified fund offered at very low cost. So that's the asset manager that I had in mind. What sort of stewardship makes sense for that manager? To this, one might turn to modern portfolio theory, which invites us to look at returns in terms of not only expected return, but also systematic risk. So the goal, as portfolio theorists say, is to produce is not to maximize expected returns only, but to maximize risk-adjusted expected returns. And how do you score points on that measure? Well, you can increase expected returns across the portfolio, but you can also reduce the amount of systematic risk. So the claim that I made is that the portfolio investor, the BlackRocks of this world, can consistent solely with a finance theory view, solely trying to maximize the economic welfare of its beneficiaries, engage in meaningful activity on what might be regarded as the ESG dimension. But in doing so, the goal is to reduce systematic risk. And so the idea in mind is not a trade-off model. It's that we are not trading off expected returns in some domain for some social good. Rather, it's a purely economic defense of what an asset manager is doing. So then the issue is, well, what are those risks which count as sufficiently systematic that the reduction of them would in fact improve risk-adjusted returns? So the GFC of 07-09 offers one example: financial stability. If the financial system craters, if a single firm, a single systemically important firm in the ecosystem craters, then the impact is a systematic event. Why? Because the losses are felt across the whole portfolio. There's no way to diversify against the loss of a Lehman Brothers failure, or there wasn't then. So therefore, the management of financial stability is systematic. And the effort by such a manager to reduce risk-taking by systemically important financial firms, even at the cost of some give-up in expected returns, can be defended in terms of improving risk-adjusted returns. Climate change is the one that seemed to me most glaring and most important for today in thinking about what actions an economically focused investor could take to try to improve risk-adjusted returns. And so therefore, I see the action of of investors in trying to reduce this risk is, again, not involving a trade-off model, socially responsible investing, but actually can be defended purely in finance terms. And there may be other things that count as systematic in this way, but that's the issue. Are they or are they not? The claim of, I want to be clear about what the theory offers and doesn't. So there are many areas that could well be regarded by investors as very important. Social issues, diversity issues, a whole host of issues that they may want to press firms on, but they're not truly systematic. So in thinking about systematic stewardship, at least as on the account that I'm giving, it focuses on a limited set of issues that are truly of importance from an investment point of view, and to that sense provides a firm grounding for an asset manager who is worried about being criticized for imposing its own social view on how firms ought to run. This set of systematic risks the mitigation of them can be pursued solely, again, defending from a finance point of view the interests of the beneficiaries. Anyway, so that's, and one final point, which sort of fascinating in the discussion with the panelists, how different the US, say, and the UK might be, in that the critical feature for the implementation of these systematic stewardship measures is the role of the activist ESG fund. So this story borrows from the US model in which, in effect, the hedge funds propose and the shareholders dispose. So the role of the hedge funds are information intermediaries in this story. And if they tell a story about an underperformance that is persuasive to the shareholders, then it gets support. And indeed, the activists, the hedge funds gain their legitimacy because they are able consistently to come up with those stories and have and a repeat play in the reputation effects, et cetera. Well, the claim is that ESG funds can play this role. And as more millennials and others choose to invest in these funds, which have multiple goals, not just the economic goals, those funds can tee up issues which a neutral investor might nevertheless regard as systematic and serving that goal. And so it's the interaction between these special sorts of investment intermediaries and more passive index fund and other investors that provides the energy behind this account of systematic stewardship. So it's a modern portfolio, it's a theory, and then an implementation strategy as to how it might work in an advanced market. Anyway, so that's my account, and as I say, these great panelists have got such a different perspective on a lot of these issues. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Let me just say who they are. First up will be Andy Griffiths, who is the executive director. Wait, mate, I misstated. Sorry. He's two. The first up is Stephen Barrie, who is the Director of Ethics and Engagement at the Church of England Pension Board, which manages about $2.5 billion in funds, but plays a catalytic role in setting the agenda for many other funds. Second will be Andy Griffiths, who is the Executive Director of the Investor Forum, which is an organization formed on the suggestion of the 2012 K report that focuses on limited engagements with a small group of targeted firms over the course of the year. And those who belong to the forum have $24 trillion in assets worldwide under management and $800 billion in the UK, which is 1/3 of the stock market in the UK. Our third speaker is Deborah Gilshan, founder of the 100% Club. Gender diversity was a focus of hers, beginning with work for the 30% Club. I think she herself has diversified into more general advice about governance matters. The fourth speaker is let's see. No, that's 5. Is Sarah Wilson, founder and CEO of Manifest Voting, now the CEO of Minerva, which means she is in the cockpit of all the data, the governance data about firms. And we've been discussing data, metrics. Sarah, I think, has got the best real world experience of anyone here as to how hard it is to get reliable data. So that'll be, I think, a great addition. And then the fifth is Tom Tayler. Yes, whoops. My notes are not so organized. Yeah, Tom Tayler, who is Senior Manager at Sustainable Finance Center for Excellence at Aviva Investors, which is a global asset manager. Anyway, so Stephen, why don't you start us?
Thanks very much, Jeff.
Yes.
For those online. Thanks very much. Actually, we're at about 3.7 billion AUM now. You mentioned 2.5. That was a couple of years ago. And it shows that, I mean, we've had about 10% investment performance over the last 10 years or so. So relatively strong, even though we're doing lots of responsible investment activity. So this is kind of a plug for the fund, not just because we're going to be recruiting over the next month. Like Jane used this opportunity to say we're going to be recruiting, keep an eye out. But we look after the retirement savings for about 41,000 beneficiaries, the majority of whom were Church of England clergy, or are Church of England clergy. So the exam question is, what is systematic stewardship and how is it pursued? And my comment's going to focus on the second half of that. How do you pursue systematic stewardship as a strategy rather than as a normative theory or a legal justification for stewardship? So I think you need to do the basics well. You can start with that. So the basics, as I take it, are proxy voting. We vote our shares, maintaining a restricted list of screening that eliminates the worst companies or the most egregious ESG categories of business or services. Having a robust manager monitoring framework and engagement framework with your asset managers to make sure that they stay on mandate and are incorporating ESG in an integrated way. Having a portfolio level strategy of integrating stewardship and ESG, so incorporating that into allocation decisions, for example, around which passive index you choose. And then finally, kind of at the peak of that, there's what we've called in the past impact engagement, or you might frame as systematic stewardship. I'm going to give a couple of examples of initiatives that we've been involved with, and then some reflections or some considerations around those initiatives. So the first, these have all been mentioned today at various different points. So the Transition Pathway Initiative is a collaborative engagement that we worked with Marion at the Environment Agency Pension Fund to found back in 2017. It's now backed by investors with $40 trillion of assets under management and provides climate assessments across management quality and carbon performance, so traditional governance, but also a forward-looking measure on climate alignment, and provides those assessments to the public, in the public domain, and benchmarks them against transition pathways from the IEA. What we think is particularly important is that it's a tool that is designed to be decision useful for investors. At its heart, it's got an academic team at the other place, at the London School of Economics. They're driving the analysis. It's led by asset owners. It has a public methodology and public analysis based on public disclosure of the corporations that it's assessing. And really, we think about the TPI as a catalytic intervention, providing a tool to the investment community, the wider financial ecosystem, to companies and to the general public that can form part of the accountability architecture around climate change. TPI itself is not prescriptive, so whether you fall into the camp of thinking that divestment is a duty and a requirement, or whether you think that the other way around, that engagement is what we ought to be pursuing, or if you think that there's an interesting blend of both divestment and engagement, whatever you think, whatever your theory of change is around stewardship, TPI can form part of that model, and we integrate TPI in our passive index, in our engagement with individual issuers, in our engagement and monitoring of our asset managers, in our proxy voting. So it forms kind of right across our stewardship strategy. So that's the first example, is providing something that's a kind of a common good public tool. Marion mentioned the disaster at Samarco, and so did Paul earlier on, the disaster at Samarco, where a joint venture between Vale and BHP caused the death of 19 people back in 2015. The follow-up to that was some intensive investor engagement with BHP and with Vale that sought assurances that governance changes had been made and that this wouldn't happen again. In 2019, on the 25th of January, one of Vale's tailings facilities at a place called Brumadinho in Brazil, in Minas Gerais, collapsed and caused the death of about 270 people. So the same kind of structure, it was an upstream constructed tailings facility, caused an order of magnitude greater harm. And because of the experience of investors engaging with BHP and Vale, we were quite well positioned to say, actually, we need a slight change in the model, engaging the issue, not just the issuers. That started the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative, where we kind of recognized that there wasn't the expertise among stewardship investors or ESG investors to really address this. We convened a series of roundtables, asked for a novel company disclosure of itemizing tailings facilities, and that generated a response from 85% of the mining industry by market capitalization. Those disclosures that we generated, we housed in a global tailings portal online, freely available to the public, and cross-referenced with GIS data. So you can actually look at a map and see the satellite imagery of the dams, and then the hazard profile of those facilities. Thinking about reporting, most diversified mining companies had disclosure on tailings dams in the front half of their annual report, and some provisions for rehabilitation and closure in the back half of the annual report. But you'd be hard pressed to find any list of all of the facilities of diversified miners before the last few years. So there wasn't that standardized industry-wide disclosure. So we asked for the disclosure, housed that disclosure in the portal, worked with the industry through the ICMM, the industry body, and with the UN Environment Programme to develop a global tailings standard, so a management, global industry standard on tailings management designed to improve practice, make sure that best practice is the minimum standard. And then we're in the process right now of developing a global institute to drive the adoption and provide assurance around the application of that global standard. So really using levers, all of the levers that are available to us as an institutional investor that has a convening power, that can work collaboratively with banks and with insurers and with global institutions like UN Environment Programme to drive change. There have been tailings disasters since Brumadinho, and we expect there are likely to be disasters in the future. But what's changed is that company attention, board attention has changed within the mining sector. And we hope that, we think we've got some good reason to believe that some of the risks have been mitigated through these initiatives. So the reflections that I wanted to bring out was that this is you might call it a paradigm, or you might call it a mode of engagement that is collaborative and catalytic. It's issue focused, not issuer focused, although it's always going to cash out in terms of issuers. Another advantage of going for the issue and not the issuer is that it can apply across asset classes. So on the mining safety initiative, we've had private funds come involved and apply the standards to all of their mining holdings. We're involved in creating global standards, so the tailing standard, but also there's a standard on corporate climate lobbying that's interesting to talk more about, which are voluntary standards, but they are backed by shareholder stewardship, by exercise of governance rights. So in January this year, we informed released our intention to vote against the chairs of mining companies that were not committing to implement the global standard. So that's a voluntary standard, but backed by investor stewardship. These are tools that we hope are useful, whatever your stewardship model, whether it's divest or engage, or a blend. And we're thinking about these interventions as improving the conditions within which issuer-based investor stewardship can succeed. So if we can encourage an entire industry or entire market to adopt tools and adopt standards, then the risk profile of any individual issuer that we have in our portfolio is going to be improved there. So collaborative, responsive, deliberative, and ambitious. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Stephen. And I mean, we should just take a moment to reflect on the quality of those two initiatives. If you think about how stewardship has evolved over 20 or 30 years, even 10 years ago, I guess you guys probably wouldn't even imagine that might be something that you would do. But it sits at a much higher level than that company engagement that we perhaps characterized stewardship with in the early days. So, I mean, just wonderful examples. So really encourage the audience to focus on the value of those. And my first comments really are, whatever your model of stewardship or engagement, once you manage somebody else's money, you become a steward. And you can be a good steward, a bad steward, an absentee landlord. You can come in many, many forms. And that's the wonderful thing about a marketplace. People can choose who manages their money for them. Different services can emerge. And you sometimes see these wonderful innovations, as we've just seen there. And so we should really celebrate actually markets that you can come up with some of those innovative developments that you just wouldn't have imagined. You couldn't have programmed. A policy initiative couldn't have foretold. So the power of the market sometimes to bring together incredibly intelligent people to act on an issue that is important is really crucial. And so for me, stewardship is not something about telling people how to do things. It's about how you fulfill the responsibilities that you have to your ultimately the owner or the beneficiary. And we've talked about that a lot, about retail flavors. My history has been in asset management. The group that I lead now works with asset owners and asset managers, domestic and international, boutique and large investors. But Deborah and I were talking about for many, many years, the relationship between asset managers and asset owners has really been quite poor. And the real understanding of a really clear mandate. What is your mandate for action? What are you going to deliver? What kind of steward are you going to be? These kind of things haven't been coded anywhere near as effectively as they could have been. And as a result, trust really ends up being exhibited through anecdotes, as Paul Lee said this morning. But, as Stephen has just shown us, there are some really good anecdotes that you can use. So I think increasingly we need to focus on this mandate, because if we can't get the relationship between institutional asset owners and institutional asset managers really sharp, the chances of getting it right on a retail relationship is quite complex. It's further complicated because capital is global. So, 25% of the UK stock market is owned by US mutual funds. Well, US citizens' views on stewardship, they may or may not align with the domestic agenda. Similar situations will occur in many different countries. So ultimately, capital is fungible. So therefore, you have to find systems and techniques that can blend the activities of market participants. The ultimate owners can choose, and much as you can give power to retail investors more and more, equally, more and more service providers can provide much clearer examples of what great stewardship is, allowing the customer to choose a professional service and pay for it if they think that's appropriate. So there's a lot for the industry to do. The work that I do focuses on trying to help the largest institutions work together to escalate the really complex problems, to try and resolve the challenges that individual engagement is not allowing to happen, to be resolved effectively. And that involves, my job is very much like a mountain guide. If you're going to go to the Himalayas, you'll be fitter than ever in your life. You'll be very motivated. You'll definitely be able to read a map. But you won't be allowed to go to many of the places on your own, and you certainly wouldn't choose to if you want to get the most out of your trip. And so to help investors work together to fulfill their stewardship objectives, you sometimes need these critical groups, and it could be an activist catalyst, as you've described in the US model. In the UK, we have this investor forum. So we build trusted relations with individual asset managers and asset owners, and we work out solutions to try and tackle some of these most complex problems. To do that, we have to have an incredibly thoughtful and methodical underlying legal understanding, because the challenges that accrue when you collaborate can be very substantial. And this is a really relatively unique part of our function, but all collaborative initiatives really need to have that underpinning of legal understanding so that they don't put the partners in unnecessary risk. One of the features of that model, therefore, is that people can opt in or opt out. We don't bind members simply because they're members. We build a coalition for each specific issue. So it's the opposite of Jeff's model. Every company is different. As far as I can tell, every asset owner and asset manager are different. Blending those forces to address a problem is a really fascinating behavioral challenge, actually, which is what has motivated me to do this. When you can blend those forces together, you do come up with an idiosyncratic solution. But what holds it together is when you search for a solution rather than simply reiterate a problem. If over time you can build a track record of solving issues, you then begin to build a systemically important piece of infrastructure. And so in our 7 or 8 year history, we've published the case studies every year, so that over time you build up a case history of 45 or so investments now. And the world can judge that. It's publicly available. When we started, not all asset managers disclosed what they had engaged on, but it's there for all to see, and you can judge whether it's effective or not. But it's certainly the case now that in the UK market, there is an escalation mechanism with a track record. So those that say asset managers don't engage, the quiet conversations don't have any impact, well, there is some evidence that you can judge to see at least one window on that. So I'll perhaps just leave my comments there, really, because I do think one part we really should focus on is the role of the market and the ability of people to come together to solve problems. And it's very difficult for investors to impose solutions on companies. Of course, they have voting rights, but that should be the last resort. Ideally, you should have a shared agenda with the management team. You should be able to rely on the board of directors to execute against those plans, and the management to deliver against that strategy. And when it fails, you intervene. But if external parties are having to impose on companies the nature of their behavior, they are stepping into the boardroom, and there's an asymmetry of information. The external world has far less information about what happens in that company. And all of my experience tells me that the big decisions are about capital and resource allocation. They're about people, they're about succession, and they're about reputation and the choice of service that you choose to make. So you can observe those outputs from the outside, and when they're not delivering the required outcomes, or when externalities are not being appropriately considered, then you can raise your voice and pressure. But the company has many other issues going on inside it, which are very difficult to understand, and you should be changing the directors at the point at which you become unhappy with the outcomes. And so resolutions definitely get things onto the agenda, but they're a very crude instrument relative to the complexity of the organisation that you're dealing with and seeking to influence change. Going to Deborah next.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. So my name is Deborah Gilshan. I've had the privilege of working in investment stewardship for just over 21 years. And I say privilege because, we ultimately are acting on behalf of other people with their money. I'm particularly interested in the role of asset owners and the power of asset owners to convene and to intervene. And I particularly would echo Andy's comments and applauding the work of the Church of England Pensions Board in that regard. Professor Gordon, I really welcome your paper because I think it's really important that we have a debate and a discussion about the nature of stewardship and the nature of interventions in stewardship. I think it's really provocative because you pitch systematic stewardship approaches against perhaps one-to-one engagements with companies. And actually, I think there's a really fundamental role for all of that. But I think there's also an urgency to some of the systemic issues that we as a society face, for which I think finance plays such a critical part of the solution. And so what I really like about your paper is it made me think about the efficiency of interventions and how they interplay and act together. I talked earlier about the role of annual general meetings. And I guess my frustration sometimes with what I see about the nature of stewardship is that it's often just about voting and engagement, one-to-one engagement, which is really powerful and important. But actually, it can't just be about that, because we have, as equity shareholders and other providers of capital, we have a whole range of rights that are available to us. And what I'd love to see is a reframing of stewardship so that it's about the exercise of all of our rights, including shareholder proposals, attending annual general meetings and speaking, as well as divestment if you're an active manager. And I'm also really caught by this concept of activist stewardship, which CalSTRS, the California State Teachers Retirement System, coined around what they called corporate castles. So basically companies that seem intransigent to any sort of interventions by shareholders, including collective efforts. I also would really echo Jennifer's comments from the start of the day about the powerful role of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. I had the absolute privilege to have a secondment with them about 10 years ago when I worked for the Railways Pension Fund. They were RailPen was the first international member of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. And I think what they've done in the purity of the voice of asset owners and how they've exercised their voice and corralled other investors, including on Rio Tinto, I think is another really good example of, I guess, systematic interventions. But I guess we need more of them. And I'm interested as well in the different roles that asset owners and asset managers and activists play if we want to optimise, I guess, the impact and the efficiency of stewardship. When I worked, again, for an asset owner, we filed shareholder proposals, particularly in the US, on seeking an independent board chair. And I remember having a conversation with an asset manager, and they said, look, we can't file that, we can't do that, but you can as an asset owner, and we can stand next to you and sometimes behind you. And actually, it was really enlightening, I guess, as to the willingness of some shareholders to only use certain rights that are available to them. So I think we need to have a kind of a conversation about that and a reframing of what stewardship is, because these interventions aren't discrete either. You can be going to an annual general meeting, you could be collaborating, but you could also be privately engaging with a company. All of that works. I think what I also like about your paper is it really positions the role of social stability risks and what we need to do to solve them. We've talked a lot about climate change today, and I absolutely recognise that it's the most systemic and systematic risk, I guess, that we all face. But we also have deep inequalities that I think, again, finance is part of the solution to. I've unfortunately for me, spent many years analysing executive pay structures. And it really interests me that we don't have collaborative, systematic interventions on executive pay, which I think is a risk to society, excessive executive pay. But we have other collaborations on climate change, for example. I think the system of executive pay in this country is broken because you have a system where boards can receive 70% votes against on the outcomes of pay plans, but because the resolution is advisory, the solution is more engagement. And actually, so I think we need to think about the utility of engagement, but also the futility of engagement, because why would I want to have a further conversation about a plan I fully understood, but I voted against it because I didn't think it was in my client's interests? So I think we need to have a conversation about how boards respond when stewardship interventions from shareholders actually work. I think the other area I would give as an example is diversity. So I started to engage through working for Railpen in 2011 on diversity, specifically gender diversity, a year after the 30% Club was set up. Dame Helena Morrissey was very clever to know the power of investor capital in achieving better representation on corporate boards. And there was a lot of other investors who didn't think this was important. And if you look at the growth of the investor group of the 30% Club here in the UK, we started in 2011 with 7 members, and Railpen was the only asset owner, with 1.6 trillion in assets under management. And now you have 40 investors with over 11 trillion pounds in asset under management. And I think that's such a strong market signal, not to just companies that the investor group is engaging with, but on every other company and other investors, that these are systemic issues that need systematic and systemic approaches like collaboration and collective voice. I would also observe that I think stewardship is in a really critical point in its own evolution and its purpose. I believe that if we get this right, the visibility of what we're doing on behalf of other people really will demonstrate the social utility of finance, and that finance is a social good and a public good. But we're not there yet, because I always use the analogy of my mum. And my mum is a pensioner, and she takes her pension from a local council here in the UK. And she always dreads when I say that I'm going to speak at conferences, because she says, please don't use me as an example. But it's a really powerful example for me, and I hope it's a powerful example for others. So she takes her pension and she reads the newspapers because, she's interested in the world, and she sometimes reads the business section, and she sees that a retailer that she shops in, is giving their CEO a big bonus. And then she reads that 70% of the shareholders voted the decision down. And I am really excited, and I tell her, Mum, the shareholders have risen up and they voted against the board on this. And she literally shrugs her shoulders, rolls her eyes and says, yes, but he still gets the money. And I think the challenge that finance has is that we can't be seen as complicit in a system that is still giving outcomes that the end beneficiary, the pensioner, doesn't understand why the outcome is different. And so I'll stop there, because I hope that's been provocative enough for the end of the day. But I think there's huge opportunity, but I guess it's a collective responsibility on all of our shoulders to make this about, the end beneficiary and getting the best outcomes for them, both financial and societal.
Thanks. It's always tricky to speak at the end of a provocative day, because there have been so many ideas circulating. You think, gosh, yeah, I wish I thought about that one. So I just want to thank Dionysia for organising today's event, because it is at such an important time. A few years ago, Andy Haldane, who's was an economist at the Bank of England, talked about the decade of asset management. And much as I like Andy's speeches, I think he was wrong, because I think we're in the decade of asset ownership. And so that's why I'm particularly attracted to this idea of systematic stewardship, and how is it pursued, and how do we know that it's worked. So just a little bit about me. So yes, I hate to say it, I have been doing proxy voting, corporate governance research since 1995. And so we were in the dizzy heights of the post-Cadbury era at that time. And it might be argued that we were doing systematic stewardship at that time, because there was a lot of collectivization of corporate governance initiatives through various investor bodies, which set guidelines. And it's the memory of those systematic approaches, which actually leave me quite concerned at the idea that we should go back to it, because it didn't, as Andy said, really respond to the market. And markets are driven by data. And it's the data and the transparency which I hope is actually going to encourage the trust and understanding that we have in stewardship. But before we get to the data, words are data. I'm very interested in words. I love listening to the words that people use. And in the paper and in the discussions today, I've heard quite a number of them. I've heard passivity, activism, imposing social ideas, market concentration, agenda setting, trust, the cockpit of data. And I hope that I'm not going to crash the aeroplane data into the Hudson. And I think actually Captain Sully had a point to make. Trusting autopilots isn't necessarily a terribly good idea. And that's what worries me about systematic stewardship. Because I say to a lot of people, you know, when the financial system is crashed, central banks will come in, put money, burn us all out, and we'll go back to the beginning again. But we can't crash society. We can't crash the planet. And I think it's terrible.
I'm really sorry.
Another one.
Apparently this is now going. If you could just hold that. Great, thank you.
It's all right. So we can't crash the planet. We can't crash society. So the idea that we lock ourselves into another mode of stewardship, having learned that one didn't work, worries me greatly. And so I've heard a lot about, oh, well, we need one single metric of ESG. We need one single metric of corporate governance. We should all do things the same way. And I just want to run screaming from the room and say, no, you need a market for data. You need a market for intelligence. You need argumentative panels like this one, who will mostly agree, but at the margins will also disagree quite violently, but go away and then contemplate it on things. The other thing that I think that has been missing a little bit from today is the discussion about politics, psychology, and geography, because these things separate us as much as they join us. And I think ECGI has really pulled off something important here by pulling everybody together post-pandemic to talk about these things. How we do stewardship here in the UK and Europe is fundamentally different to how it's done in other markets, whether that's Japan or North America. I get a little bit worried when the papers that I read, and I do read a lot of them, assumes that what works in one country is going to work in another, and that the language we use in one country automatically translates to another. It just doesn't. You know, company law systems are very, very different. You know, I have to remind people, shareholders don't actually have very many rights in America in comparison with what they have here in Europe. And so they have to use different tools in different ways. So I think it's great that we talk about systematic stewardship, but I want to have that caveat that we need the data from all of the markets. And this is where I get into another film analogy, because I love Lego. My children love Lego. And anybody who's watched the Lego movie will know what I'm talking about, is that you can have a model or you can have the model. Now, if we want to be master builders, we take the building blocks and we create models, plural, and we find out what works and we share them with one another and we see what works in what sector, because what works in mining isn't necessarily going to work in retail, isn't necessarily going to work in tech. So the idea that we're trying to build this one size fits all, the UK moved away from that, and that was the whole point about the Stewardship Code. What the Walker Review was actually saying was that the systematic stewardship that we had in the run-up to the crash had been helpful to a point, and it was well intended, don't get me wrong. You know, people really meant well by it, but it became very, very concentrated and narrow in the way that it looked at things. So we had the Walker Review. We contributed to the Walker Review. We showed, for example, that when it came to, say, banking bonuses, there'd been a lot of talk about it, but nobody was ever voting on them. Nobody was voting on audit resolutions. So this is one of the powers of being a bit of a data geek. Yes, we have been collecting this data for a long time, and what we're now seeing is what things are working, what things are not working, which takes us back to the asset owners. Last year, fund managers had to start producing what are called implementation statements for their clients. And it was a car crash. Forget plane crash. It was a pile up on the M25 of monumental proportions. But it's been a learning opportunity. Now, these implementation statements are baked into the Pensions Act. Fund managers have to provide data on what they've done and how they've done it alongside their stewardship code reports. Trustees have to absorb that data, see what's been done in their name. They have to consult with their clients. So I don't buy into the idea that we've got asset managers imposing a view anymore. I have actually sort of said elsewhere, I think asset owners have been a little bit weaponized, actually. You know, they've really been motivated to be more demanding because it's baked into law. It's one of the few changes in corporate governance in recent years that's been baked into a hard law. Previously, it was all codes and soft law, but the Pensions Act is an incredibly powerful change mechanism where trustees now actually have to go out and consult, find out what their trustees think, find out what the fund managers are doing in their name. This is then all feeding back to the companies, but it all comes back to standards. You can have standardized disclosures, but they're not necessarily all the same. We know that the unit of disclosure is consistent and trustworthy, but we can look at what the data is telling us. But what we can't assume is that the model that we take from Japan is going to work in the UK, is going to work in the US. All of these countries have geopolitical problems of their own. We heard earlier about, oh, well, you know, in China, we did this, da, da, da. I turned to my partner at the desk and I said, that's interesting. But what about minimum wage problems in North America? What about too controversial, obviously. What about, you know, prisoners being paid sort of, you know, cents in order to, you know, stamp out number plates? Countries frame their political problems in different ways, and investors are stuck in the middle of all of this, trying to make sense of it all. So what's the answer? Definitely more data, more consistent data, responsiveness to data. And, you know, Caroline mentioned earlier about, you know, she wished that more people had joined in with her on sort of particular initiatives. We've got to do more sharing of initiatives. This is absolutely critical. We were gathering data on board diversity back in 95, 96, and it took a long time before the 30% picked this story up. Why was that? Well, it was to do with who holds the pen. Who holds the pen on regulation? Who holds the pen on codes? Asset owners were not always listened to. They had these concerns, but their concerns weren't fed into the system. And at the moment, asset owners are currently facing absolute mountain of lobbying on, say, SPACs and on multi-class shares, etc. We actually have to have more honest conversations about how codes are developed, who controls that process, so that everybody does feel as though they're heard, even if at the end of the day, somebody has to make a decision about what the law is going to be. And to Deborah's point, yes, we're working for ordinary people. Trust in the system matters. I don't believe that we're going to get trust in the system if we impose one-size-fits-all, top-down forms and modes of ESG. So we can be systematic without imposing one-size-fits-all. And I think that's an absolutely crucial thing. We can be systematic about how we collect the data, how we report to the clients. But let's have a million ideas bloom when it comes to ESG and corporate governance, because that's the only way that we're actually going to learn about anything. So that's really what I wanted to contribute, which is thank you for your paper. I think it triggers some very important conversations, and that's the point of this today. Let's learn from each other, but let's not just think we're back to one size fits all. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join this this panel and for the event. I think what we've heard across the panel and really across the day is that there are these different approaches, and that we need a sort of all of the above approach, with people choosing which bits work for their understanding of their duty to the people whose money it actually is, and transparency about what they're doing so that they can be judged on what they are or what they aren't doing. And I think we've heard from lots of people who are incredibly engaged in and incredibly passionate about stewardship. And it's important to remember that whilst stewardship is evolving, developing in lots of positive and exciting ways, that actually Some elements of it still have quite a lot of development to do, and a lot of the time we're talking about equity. But the credit markets are a huge amount bigger than equity. So the development of engaging on credit is incredibly important, particularly for asset owners who often are much more interested in credit than in. So thinking about how we use.
Sorry.
That's okay. Oh, it's back.
Okay.
Thinking about how we use our voice when companies come to the market for debt or refinancing, there are engagement opportunities there too. We need to think across all asset classes, which the UK FRC code is clear about. So is this going to be third time looking?
I'm just going to try and
Okay. Is that, yeah. So how are we going to be good stewards of the real assets that we own? You can have huge impact on some of the issues that we've been talking about today in terms of sustainability. If you decarbonize a building, if you think when you are renewing infrastructure, how you do that in a more both environmentally and socially positive way. And one very underserved class that again is crucial to asset owners. So as part of a group which includes a large insurer is sovereign debt. So engagement on sovereign debt, whilst that has very different issues to corporate and needs to be done with sensitivity, engagement on sovereign debt is incredibly important because the governments that issue the sovereign debt are the ones that have the biggest levers to address these issues that are important to all of us. So, for example, we now annually write to the finance ministers and central bank governors of the biggest sovereign debt holdings that we make, talking about things like their role within the NGFS. Are the finance ministers part of the Helsinki Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action? What are they doing on their NDCs? Are they engaging in COP15 on biodiversity? Where's their national action plan on business and human rights? So these are really important issues too. Now, Professor Gordon's paper about systematic stewardship is interesting in terms of the way that he thinks about the difference between idiosyncratic and systematic risk in the context of one portfolio theory. But actually, I think we also need to think one stage higher about systemic risk. So not just the risk that you accept being within the market or being within the system, but the risks to the system. So for example, not just what are the risks to the companies and the other issuers that we invest in, but what are the risks that they themselves are embedding and causing? And so that systemic stewardship, or if you like, stewardship of the markets themselves, is an important next step to think about. And when it comes to this, actually, that can be one of the most powerful levers that financial market participants have for addressing some of these questions that we are thinking about in terms of ESG and sustainability. So thinking about that systemic engagement on market failures and systemic risks is a crucial part of that all of the above approach, the menu, if you like, of choosing what you're going to do and how. So are you going and speaking to policymakers, regulators and governments and saying, how are you helping us? Not passing the buck, not saying you need to do all of this for us, but we need to work in partnership. We need an enabling environment from you, and we will implement our side of the bargain. If you look at all the net zero alliances that make up GFANs, they all have a caveat. They say, we will try and do our part of the bargain if you deliver Paris. But you can't just say that and give yourself a get out of jail free card. You have to go to the governments and say, what are you doing to deliver Paris? You all signed up to say we're going to align financial flows with the carbon and sustainable development goals of Paris. How can we make that happen together? Because ultimately, this is race to zero is one we win or lose altogether. So I think the addition of real transparency about what market participants are doing in terms of their engagement with policymakers. We know that there's really positive action that goes on there, but also that there are those who are lobbying for the status quo, so transparency of what's happening. And thinking about how can we, as market participants, best serve the long-term interests of our of our customers, but also actually our self-interest in having a workable financial system by engaging at a systemic level. Ultimately, if you look at sort of systems change theory, the system is delivering the way it's been set up for. At the moment, we've got a system that's about extraction and maximization of profit. And we need a system that's to sort of go back to a sort of a Brundtland sense of sustainability that meets the needs of today without undermining the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we have a huge role as market participants in playing our role in bringing that about. And so I would say we also need a systemic level, one level above the systematic, and then the individual and collective actions that we've heard about from the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the audience who's been patiently sitting, but I want to just add a sort of a factual, sort of an observation that I've been really struck by, just flying over the Atlantic. The difference in some of the discussion here would just feel very out of place in the United States, and I've been thinking a little bit about why. And part of it is I'm throwing this out. I'm curious about reactions. The nature of pension of retirement savings and pension provision is quite different in the United States than, say, I think in the UK or certainly in Europe, in a way that changes so much of the discussion that we might have among us. There are two places, the UK and the United States, which supposedly have got the same sort of dispersed ownership system, in fact, have quite different structures of ownership. So in the United States, the defined benefit plan is dissipating quite a lot for reasons, accounting reasons, inflation reasons, many reasons. So basically, employees are migrated to defined contribution plans, as opposed to what seems in the UK that defined benefit plans are quite robust. And the defined benefit plans form themselves. No? Well, anyway, let me finish my theory. So in the United States, the half of the citizens who have the benefit of the plans are thinking, how is my welfare going to be improved? And they focus mightily on stock market and shareholder value. The maximization of it seems directly connected to their well-being. If, on the other hand, you have a defined benefit plan in which, in effect, the assets are collateral for the commitments made by whoever makes the commitments, you yourself don't directly see benefit or loss in what happens to stock market values up or down, which opens up space, political space, and other space for the asset owners to play a distinctive role, which they certainly don't play in the United States. Now, I don't know if that's a significant. I don't know if the pension planning point is sufficiently robust to carry the claim I'm making, but you do see quite a bit of difference in the citizens' focus on shareholder value as connected to their well-being, and the latitude of the asset owners in the UK, which seems to be somewhat divorced from that as an exclusive goal. But anyway, so that's just a thought. But I want to open up to the audience for reactions to the discussion, the terrific interventions we've had, and any other comments that are kind of you're burning to say after the course of this day. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm Murray Burt with the Asset Manager DWS. I guess 2 or 3 just thoughts and a question. The issue of systemic stewardship, I think, was really needed, but we don't yet really have the idea of environmental and social thresholds and how costs and benefits of environmental and social issues are distributed. Those aren't really concepts that are really embedded in ESG yet. I think people say, oh yes, we're going to improve a company But if it's still violating the thresholds, then that's really there. So I think that's a barrier to systemic stewardship. As a German-based asset manager, it would be great if we could get Germany and Europe to change acting in concert laws so that we can do more cooperation with other investors. But I try to do a little bit of my time over the last 8 years to advise the European Commission on energy efficiency, and that's been useful and I think, but it's not really that sort of policy long-term engagement on very specific topics is just not done very much. Like, I think the people in the room are the exceptions to the rule, and a few others who aren't here. So like, how do we really ramp up so that there's as much focus there? It's seen as important. It looks like I get a bit of a pat on the back when I can have a good case study in the stewardship code and say, oh yeah, that's good, or I can trot it out and talk about it sometimes, but it's not really seen as, oh, this is really an important thing that we should be doing much more of. Because I used to be a business lobbyist 10 years ago. Like, I know what it takes to lobby governments, and the investment world is not doing that.
Maybe we'll collect comments and then get panelists' comments. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. I just want to touch on the acting in concert concern quickly, because I think it's overplayed quite a lot. And ultimately, you know, I think but ultimately the regulation is around the where the issue is headquartered. So I think to blanket say you can't do collaborative engagement when there's plenty of other institutional investors who are engaging with companies based in the UK. I mean, the PRI has done work with lawyers on this and have come to the conclusion that actually there's quite a bigger scope of activities that investors can conduct collaboratively. So I mean, we can maybe talk about that later, but I think I really want to congratulate you on the paper. I think it kind of puts into basically academic speak what some practitioners have been coining in terms of the phrase universal ownership for quite a long time. I think we see some asset owners and large investment managers who are now actively using that in their marketing material and how they would describe themselves. But ultimately, and it's a very, I think, eloquent and intuitive theory, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective on how that can be taken to convince those who are maybe slightly more skeptical in terms of maybe empirical arguments as to how much they should commit to systemic stewardship as opposed to stewardship with individual issuers, idiosyncratic stewardship, as I think you call it. And then maybe my last question would be in relation to common ownership and the antitrust concerns of those in the big, well, particularly in relation to the big three, how you see that playing out with systemic stewardship. Thanks a lot.
Right. Let me just respond to the last point. So part of again, from a U.S. perspective, part of the reason why focusing as I have on sort of a kind of a thin theory of stewardship in a certain way, systematic stewardship, finance-based, is precisely to try to counter the claims of those who would say the big three have all this power. So the claims about systematic stewardship, in effect, any diversified investor, whether there are 3 of them or 25 of them, would be concerned to reduce the level of systematic risk in the portfolio, which includes risk to the general economy. Of course, that's the whole point, really. So in a way, the argument is an effort to try to counter the common ownership claim by saying their power is not their power is only that they reflect the interest of a diversified investor, and that's going to have benefits for the beneficiaries, but also costs generally as well, because the investors, because they're diversified, have a neutral approach to risk. They're prepared to see firms take risks and fail, but those firms have employees who are not so well off. and so it's in a way that was a little bit my reaction to the first panel of the morning, which is, I mean, at least from the perspective I'm speaking about in the U.S., the assumption that firm earnings were stable and to be counted upon, and shareholders needed only a financial rate of return, is certainly inconsistent with the way governance theorists for a generation have thought in the United States, where risk taking is desired because that propels growth. There are adjustment costs, but those cannot be internalized by a single firm. And so that's the real challenge is within a dynamic economy, what are the limits to what real firms can do to insure against losses that result because of the dynamism which diversification fortifies and propels. And so, you know, that's why it was so valuable to me to fly across the Atlantic, because there is a very different perception here. I mean, you can feel it. And these are two economies which are thought to be identical in their ownership patterns, and yet the attitudes about some of this risk bearing and risk shifting seem quite different to me. There is in the United States an incredible focus on low fees. The claim is, in effect, that active investment doesn't return well for investors. So you want to have a diversified portfolio with the lowest fees, which doesn't leave space for the kind of the ingenious work that the Church of England has done. Right? That's not what you would find BlackRock thinking conceivably of doing. And yet there don't seem to be a robust set of institutions like the Church of England to act in this catalytic role. And I think that's kind of a fascinating piece of comparative governance, which, you know, I'm going to try to go back and get some folks to reflect upon. Anyway, but the panelists, so in response to what one another said and further thoughts.
So just to reflect on Murray's comment, I've got German clients and a German owner, and I can promise you the conflict of interest concert party thing is a major roadblock. It is very, very real. It defies common sense. I completely agree. But there we are. It's a reality. I mean, there are other issues with European regulation, which, you know, in terms of the role of mancos and sub-advisors, which create complexities. But in respect to the DC-DB transition, most pension schemes are now DC over here. But actually, just from a societal perspective, there is not the culture of investing in the stock market. And there hasn't been. It was always seen as a wealthy person's activity. We now have an auto-enrollment system, so typically NEST, N-E-S-T, which is not the thermostat, but it's a pension scheme. So everybody in the country, if they haven't got a pension scheme, is enrolled into a default scheme. Italy is about to launch its own guidance for pension schemes on monitoring managers. But also this thing about fees. Governance doesn't have to cost a lot. And I think how we think about value for money is actually crucially important. BlackRock has, under Michelle Edkins, a very, very large team, which is very active. They do get involved in all kinds of initiatives. Fund managers, even the low-cost ones, are very profitable. So I think when we throw around words like, oh, it's expensive, we actually have to say, well, what do you mean by that? And well, what's the impact of not doing it? Because that's also expensive as well, because you have the fund community will privatize the gains and socialize the losses. So cost is a bundle of concepts, which I think we just need to unpack. Anyway, moving on.
Thank you. Just to come back slightly to Murray's point about systemic stewardship. I mean, so we actually heard this morning about the situations where an engagement with an individual corporate, they might say, actually, this is gonna hit my bottom line, and I've got duty to my shareholders, and that's where you can reach the limit of what individual engagement can do, and sometimes that will be due to market failure. That basically, if you're saying actually doing the thing that is going to cause the most efficient outcome from a societal point of view is not rewarded by the market, then you've got a market failure. And the people who can correct market failure are not market participants. And I know you know this, Murray. It's the regulators and policymakers. So we could throw our hands up and say, we've reached the limits of our individual stewardship. There's a market failure. It's our get out of jail free card. Or we can go and talk to the regulators and policymakers and say, right, we want this company to do the right thing. Here's the feedback we're getting. Even better, invite the company to come along with you and get them to say, we want to do this, but at the moment it's causing us a problem, and that sort of, we need to fix the market failures because they're undermining the sustainability agenda. We ultimately, until we reshape the system, we're making marginal gains, and that's why I think we need the systemic approach.
I just wanted to pick up your point, Jeffrey, about differences, because actually these investors are global investors. If we look at the UK marketplace, there's been a massive shift in ownership from UK-based asset owners, insurance companies and pension funds to overseas-based investors. So when an asset manager talks about, I guess, a different approach in different markets, it actually doesn't make much sense to me, not least because John Kay's report from 2012 talked about putting stewardship at the heart of investment management. He also talked about the role of the portfolio manager being combined with the supervisory role of the person employed in corporate governance, and where engagement was not merely critical, but that was supportive over time. So again, I think this is why we need a kind of a global debate about what stewardship should be doing and how we enact it, because I get that there are different ownership structures in different markets, but global investors should, long-term global investors should have stewardship at the absolute heart of their investment process. And it depresses me a little bit that, nearly 10 years on from John Kay's report, we're now back to talking about fees for stewardship, when actually it was about putting stewardship at the heart of fiduciary duty on behalf of your clients. So I just think sometimes the comparisons between countries, I know that John Kay was looking at long-termism in UK equity markets, but a lot of what he said in that report is still so current and still so relevant to other markets as well. And I know that's what also John Kay recommended the formation of the Investor Forum. There was lots of interventions, market interventions that he suggested that I think are very welcome.
Just make a very quick comment before that question comes, just to say you can be very depressed about a lot of these things, but 30% club, I think hardly any money was invested in that. Church Pensions Board, in doing what you did, just doing the right thing, hardly anything. The Investor Forum's fees, tiny. So the innovation that you're seeing for the right reason, irrespective of the economic gain, is quite impressive, actually. And I think we could be a little bit disappointed that 30 years after Cadbury, the amount of investment in stewardship is still quite low relative to what the rest of the industry does. But actually, some of the innovations of the resources that have been put have shown real sort of entrepreneurial spirit and innovation, and that's something to be cherished, actually.
Let me just follow up in 1 second. When it comes to firm-specific stewardship, the low-cost U.S. model works very effectively at eliminating performance-based gaps, right? I mean, the activist-investor interaction with the index funds or the asset managers works extremely effective at the firm-specific level to deal with the management team that isn't doing well. Some would, there's a debate about the cost of that, but seeing that as collectively stewardship, even though the cost to the beneficiaries in the sense of fees is zero, there are huge investments in stewardship precisely in the work that the activists do to target specific underperforming firms. The gap that I'm struck by is, in a sense, the innovation that Stephen was identifying, which are identifying places where looking at this on a firm by firm basis is not is not the approach. And no activist can be counted upon to generate the group collective action that you identify, just because there's no, I mean, you're doing it for non-economic reasons, I suppose. But and so if I'm thinking about an innovation that would be an interesting one to carry back, it's, you know, some effort to try to create these group things that you give examples of. So in a sense, the cost thing has to be seen within the system in which stewardship is delivered to the individual firm. And the fact that an index fund spends zero doesn't mean that the system as a whole might not be spending a lot of resources in evaluating how individual firms are doing, which is separate from, again, other efforts. So, but yeah, Jennifer and Di and Lucia.
I just wanted to weigh into this difference between the US and the UK. I don't think it comes down to defined benefit versus defined contribution, because I think most common law jurisdictions have gone towards defined contribution in recent years. But I really think it goes to the heart of what Sarah was talking about, the difference in shareholder rights. And the difference in shareholder rights means a difference in the balance of power between boards and shareholders. And I think that that's been very weak traditionally in the US, that shareholders have so few legislated rights compared to UK, Australia, other common law jurisdictions. And one of the really fascinating things that I think has been happening because of this globalisation of institutional investors is that in the US, they've learned how few rights they have compared to in the UK. And so what are they doing? They're now using private ordering. You know, they're not getting those rights legislated because, hey, you have Delaware, so it's, you know, it's all quite different. But, you know, there's changes to the bylaws to try and bring in governance rights that, you know, shareholders have in other places. I think that the next wave will be ESG type, you know, issues in the US, because I think the power of the global institutional investors is just growing and growing and growing. So I think that's where the real heart of the difference lies, you know, between two jurisdictions that are supposedly so similar.
Can I ask a question about activism?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, to that point, I don't like the word activism. I much prefer active ownership, because I think that's what Commonwealth countries do. They do active ownership. And so they do have systematic stewardship throughout the whole system, because what they're doing is to the point of system-wide integrated circular approaches to ESG governance is building a better system. They're thinking about the beta. They're thinking about the long-term beta as well, not maximizing the short-term returns. We don't actually have much activism in this country. There's a reason for that, is because the work that the Investor Forum does. We don't, and there's another thing. It's about, I said I like language. The framing of activism creates such hostility between boards and shareholders when theoretically everybody's in this together to win. And if boards feel as though that they're being beaten around the head with a piece of 2x4, then they don't want to engage with shareholders. But voting is a tool I believe in, but it's one tool. And I think by the time you get to a 30% vote against the company, engagement's failed somewhere along the way. So maybe we should just talk about active ownership rather than just activism.
Just wanted to address the suggestion that our motivations are entirely non-economic. I'm not sure that's quite fair. We've managed to develop some programs of work in partnership with other investors, other mainstream investors that don't have particular church ethos, for example, that's managed to generate a very significant weight of assets under management behind these initiatives, which I think is a reasonable demonstration that these are perhaps both economically motivated and motivated through institutional ethos or whatever the non-economic motivation might be. So thinking about this as overlapping reasons to to act on these systematic initiatives. We at the Church of England have an ethical investment advisory group, and Anna is the secretary of the group, and part of the role of that group is to make sure that the fiduciary duties of the funds that take the advice are balanced and appropriately combined with the ethical and the impact and the wider considerations, including even theology. You know, that's part of the excitement of that role, is that it brings a number of different domains of expertise to bear on policy, Western policy. So I would resist the characterization of the motivations for our work as non-economic or economically irrational. We certainly see them as part of our prudent stewardship of assets over the long term.
I realize that we ran out of time, but I'm going to change directions and give 2 more minutes or 3 more minutes for this panel, because I want actually to connect this panel to the conference thing, the uncertainties. And my question to you is, what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on what we are describing as systematic or systemic or portfolio-wide stewardship? In other words, what has been the impact of those recent uncertainties into forms of stewardship that are not firm specific? And the another question, which I think is quite related, is, do you think that uncertainties create more space for collaborative action, and do they create more space for bottom-up initiatives rather than top-down initiatives?
It's hard to say anything good about the COVID pandemic. I don't know. Yeah, but maybe, except we have a taker for that point of view.
Never let it go.
So UK market raised, public markets invested £40 billion to support companies through the COVID crisis, and that was all funded through very short-term accelerated book builds. So there was relaxation of the rights issue restrictions to raise capital much more efficiently, and the institutions really mobilised those resources. But those were undocumented deals, so there's a risk that the shareholder protection is much less than it would be in a rights issue. So the institutions insisted that when companies came with those capital raisings, they talked about how they would treat their employees. They talked about a much broader range of issues. And the institutions also put the companies on note that if you raise money to protect your balance sheet now, but then pay yourself excessively in a year's time, we'll be watching. So that was a wonderful exercise in public markets, actually supporting companies to be resilient. And that there's a lot of talk about the exercise of soft power, but it was used really effectively then. So that is just one small positive that I'd point to during that time frame.
So I absolutely echo that. It was a really good example. The other thing, I think, both about the pandemic and about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is that they are examples of, and if you like, almost sort of forebears of bigger crises we think are going to come, right? So COVID-19, an example of how a public health crisis caused enormous short-term, because of interventions that were made, but short-term changes in market values. And we know that if we get a climate Minsky moment, it'll be far worse, and possibly governments actually aren't equipped to step in. Whereas the invasion of Ukraine is a really unfortunate, very tragic example of stranded assets. So people who were investing in Russian companies or investing in Russian debt, who were aware of risks, overnight they became illiquid. Even before the sanctions came, there were no buyers, and investors could not move quickly enough. So if you want to see an example of how stranded assets might play out, when market participants said, oh, we've only got a couple of basis points exposure to Russia, that's because you've just fair valued them down to a couple of basis points. You've just lost your clients a big chunk of money. So those are two examples of current uncertainties that mean that we need to be thinking, globally and geopolitically in the way that we think about risk, and stewardship is a tool to manage risk, and so we have to use stewardship in that way.
Yeah, I was just going to say, never let a good crisis go to waste. And some people are just really uncomfortable with the ambiguity of that. And this is where the diversity in stewardship teams, diversity in asset management teams, in boards, etc. So, 20 years ago, when we said we weren't going to set up an office in London and let people work from home, I used to get really strange looks. That's really weird and strange. And actually, the continent of Europe and the UK seems to have migrated to like a hybrid form of working, and they're finding it very productive. And I noticed that many of the calls for got to get back to the office are coming from different parts of the world, not here. And I think this goes back to the geopolitical, the political, the local. Is that we have a very robust political system here, but on certain things we do coalesce around a more sort of social democrat form of capitalism, which is just fundamentally different to other parts of the world. Our capitalism is not the same as Japan's, and it's not the same as the US, and so we've got to celebrate the differences and learn what that brings. But I've been in the city now since before Big Bang, during and after. Some stories and ideas translated well, and others did not. We've got to be prepared to let go of the things that haven't worked and stop clinging to them just because that's the way it always was. This is not about necessarily having a revolution, but actually just saying, yeah, we're going through a shift. It's going to be uncomfortable. Strap in, and let's see what happens. And let's work together, because that's actually where we're going to get the best ideas, sharing the ideas and working together.